So, final part of this course, last one. The final part of the final focus in terms of Thatcher is the impact that Thatcher has on parties or political parties and party development. So the focus on this final bit is the extent to which Thatcher is seen to have the extent to which Thatcher is seen to have impacted the development of different political parties. So obviously her impact on the Conservative Party, her impact on Labour, and the extent of her impact of also slightly on the Liberals and the SDP, which we'll go into. So that's how I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it party by party, basically. So the first one to look at, obviously, is her impact on the Conservative Party, the really obvious one, given she was actually their leader. So despite becoming Conservative leader in 1975 and winning the 1979 election, her party did not initially go all the way with her in terms of her political ideology and ideas. The majority of her party remained moderate, sort of politically moderate in the sense that they remained close to the centre ground, not really in favour of some of her kind of more radical policies in terms of overturning the consensus. And her cabinet was dominated by men which she referred to as wets. So she would divide her cabinet into wets and dries. Wets are basically people who had been appointed by Ted Heath to the cabinet, so before she had become leader, and they were people who were committed to the post-war consensus, as opposed to dries, which were her sort of her ideological supporters who weren't committed to that. Yeah.
Did the wets know they were wet?
Yeah, they knew they were wets.
Did they have black flags?
Yeah, is it offensive to them?
Yeah.
It's meant to be slightly derogatory. But so I mean, Thatcher, in terms of her treatment of her party, she's very much, as a politician, she's a bit of a bully boy, in the sense that she seeks to dominate and bully members of her party and force them into submission in many ways. And so, I mean, she would, the way she treated a lot of cabinet members, in particular those who she deemed to be wets, was obviously quite, I wouldn't say negative, but forceful. And she was, she would force them into line when the chance arose. And so, anyway, so, yeah, for Thatcher, this idea of compromise with socialism was obviously seen to be a very negative trait, and people in her cabinet who were wets, she would gradually try to exclude them from cabinet and remove them. It's a slow process, but it's a process that she begins. And so, what she first of all does is, she first of all excludes them from key areas of economic policy. So if you're a wet and you're in cabinet, you're highly unlikely to have any role related to the economy. Instead, she would only appoint people to those key economic roles, like Chancellor, etc., people in the Treasury, who were ideologically committed dries, okay, people who were fully on board with her policies. You've got a couple of exceptions that prove the rule. People like Jim Pryor, who was considered to be a wet, he was one of the few exceptions to the rule. He was employment secretary, but even he gets shifted in a cabinet reshuffle in 1981. So reshuffles when they basically play around with who's in the cabinet. Some people get sacked, some people get moved around. So in a cabinet reshuffle in 1981, he gets shifted to Northern Ireland instead. So he becomes the Northern Ireland secretary, which is like a massive demotion. And so one of the few wets who had anything to do with the economy is moved from his job. That same 1981 reshuffle, it saw a range of further demotions for other wets and promotions for some of her keen, ideologically committed supporters, like Norman Tebbit. So she continued, after 1981, she starts to gradually reduce the influence of the wets and promote the dries at their expense. Additionally, the process of winning 2 further general elections, quite convincingly as well, allowed her to win over the majority of her party members. And so by the end of the 80s, her ideas become quite dominant, in particular among core Conservative supporters. However, despite her popularity, and her leadership style had actually become quite unpopular. Additionally, there were kind of other issues related to the economy, We talked about it already, how there was a recession in the late 80s due to her policies. And there was a particularly significant issue over the poll tax dispute. And so by 1990, her leadership was brought to an end when the party itself decides to challenge her and get rid of her. Brief summary of the poll tax dispute, because this really sums up in a nutshell Thatcher's strengths but also her weaknesses. So 1989, or it was 1990, could have been that same year, Thatcher basically wanted to reform the way that local taxes worked. Previously, the way that local councils taxed people was related to their property. It was based on the wealth or the price of their property. And so it meant that obviously if you're rich, you're going to pay more because your property will cost more. If you're poorer, you pay less because your property costs less. And so she wanted to eliminate that system because she didn't like it. Instead, she wanted to bring in a poll tax. A poll tax is basically a system which charges everybody essentially the same price or the same tax rate. And so naturally, that caused significant resentment, and there was a massive campaign against it. There was a massive campaign against the poll tax, which led to the government losing popularity. Everyone in the government and the party wanted to back down because they were like, to be honest, this is really getting out of hand. Like, there are riots all over the country. The public opposition was substantial. Thatcher absolutely refuses to budge. It's her finest quality, it's also arguably her worst. Despite the opposition, she absolutely refused to compromise, and that basically ended up being her undoing. It was really unpopular, it was not enforceable, and she refused to compromise on it. And then if you couple that with the recession that was taking place, and also the Conservatives had started to increasingly become divided over the issue of the European Union, or the newly created European Union, or was about to be created. That led to a leadership challenge in 1990. The challenge basically convinces Thatcher that she'd lost the support of her ministers, so Thatcher basically resigns in 1990. The new leader that's brought in is a man called John Major, and of all the candidates who ran to succeed her, John Major was the most Thatcherite of all the candidates. So as a result, even after she resigns, the Conservative Party continues a range of Thatcherite policies, in particular with regards to privatisation and the public sector. So, one of the first things that John Major does is he continues key Thatcher privatisations. So Thatcher had begun, for example, to sell off the electricity companies. John Major completed it. He also privatised other important industries like British Rail in 1992. He additionally continued to, so he talks a lot about how a lot of Thatcher's policies involved reducing the size of the state by outsourcing a lot of their functions to private companies. So he continues to do this by introducing elements of the free market into public services, in particular through the outsourcing of building and maintaining of schools and hospitals through PFI schemes. So I'll explain it in a bit more detail right now. So these PFI schemes are really a legacy of the John Major government. In a nutshell, it stands for Private Finance Initiative. The public sector requires money for a building of some kind. So, for example, schools or hospitals. You need the money to build the hospital, and you need the money to also run the hospital or the school, etc. The PFI schemes basically invited the private sector to come in and basically and actually pay for the building of a new hospital and even its running, in exchange for, of course, it's basically a debt. You pay it back long term with high interest rates. That's why I mentioned at the beginning, when I mentioned in the economics lecture, how PFI helps saddle NHS trusts, for example, with masses of debt which they can't pay back later on. The point is, PFI, in terms of the principle and the ideology behind it, is clearly a continuation of Thatcherite policies by outsourcing important aspects of the public sector to the private sector. So John Major carries on Thatcherite policies in that sense. He also continues the sort of more socially conservative policies of the Thatcher government as well. So he talked about how Thatcher was quite keen on family values. So things like the homosexuality laws, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, just what did you say the p.4 was again?
So it stands for Private Finance Initiative, and the basic idea behind it is you have private sector companies coming in and paying for public sector building works or investments or infrastructure, like hospitals or schools. So most hospitals you see that are brand new, the vast majority of them are paid for by the private sector. But what happens is you then have to pay it back over like 50 years or whatever with really high interest rates. So most NHS trusts are in debt because of that. But essentially, yeah, private sector pays for public sector buildings, and they get paid back later. So back to the social conservative point. So John Major continues Thatcher's social conservative points, and he basically introduces this failed, but he does try, this thing called the Back to Basics campaign, and it basically sought to emphasise traditional British values and promote, essentially, what it came down to was monogamous, heterosexual marriages and family values, those sorts of ideas. So very similar to Thatcher. It only failed because, unluckily for John Major, the press spent the entirety of the 90s running riot by exposing all of the major sex and corruption scandals that his ministers were involved in. So if you're living in the 90s, every other week there'd be a new scandal where an MP or a minister in the Major's government was having an affair, had some kind of love child, or was like selling, or they were like selling honours, peerages for money, for cash. So on the one hand, you have this public face, John Major, talking about back to basics and morality in the country and family values, and you've got a cabinet which he leads of really seedy, dirty old men cheating on their spouses and leading rather immoral lives by their own standards, of course. So it basically made them look very hypocritical and undermine the entire campaign. But the important point is that in terms of the policy itself, it was a clear continuation of socially conservative Thatcherite policies. Where they kind of abandoned Thatcherite policies was really in terms of his style of government. In the very, very first lecture on Thatcher, he started off by talking about Thatcher's core principles and beliefs and ideas. And more than any of her policies, what defines Thatcher the most is her strict ideological commitment to what she believes in and her principles and her conviction politics. Additionally, alongside that, so not only was she sort of committed to ideas and principles and convictions, she was also very presidential in her style of government, which basically meant she would sort of, impose her will on the cabinet and not really take their advice or seek their counsel. She behaved like a president, not like a prime minister, governing simply by sort of doing as she pleases in many ways, governing on her own. So John Major, on the other hand, was a very different style of government. He completely abandons this style of government, both in terms of seeking to impose his will on people and also in terms of being a strict, ideologically committed politician. Instead, one of his first acts when he becomes Prime Minister is to remove the poll tax. In face of the public opposition, John Major immediately backs down and he introduces or reintroduces a council tax that was very similar to the original one, based on property, not a poll tax basically. So that just goes to show how John Major was clearly a much more pragmatic politician than Thatcher and not so ideologically committed. And that was part of a broader style whereby he didn't really, or whereby he disliked confrontation and instead sought to be more consensual in his leadership and work with different wings of the party to try and create a compromise. Therefore, you get as a result, in the Major years, this kind of clear recognition that actually the Thatcher years were quite a tense time where there was a lot of class conflict, there was a lot of division, and then actually British politics needed to be less divided and in a way that would sort of help to heal the country, or heal those divisions that kind of come about in that period. And so, in terms of his policies, John Major very much continues in a Thatcherite fashion, and we can say that Thatcher has a very significant impact on the party, because they continue her policies afterwards, but in terms of her style, in terms of the ideological commitment, they back away from that. Arguably the most significant impact of Thatcher in terms of political party was actually not on her own party, but rather on the Labour Party. So, by 1997, Labour had been radically transformed as a political party from their position in 1983 under Michael Foot. There are still some positions that they hold that are at odds with Thatcherism. However, the argument can be made that there's three things you can argue about Labour. You can argue that Thatcher radically alters their policies. The second thing you could argue is that actually there are some ways in which Labour remains opposed to Thatcherite policies. And the last thing you can argue is that actually those changes that are brought about aren't because of Thatcher, it's for other reasons. So we'll go into those. So brief history of the party. So Labour, in 1979, lose the election under Jim Callaghan. They lose to Thatcher, basically. After their election defeat, the Labour Party lurches to the left and is taken over by sort of the far left of the party, led by Michael Foot in 1980. And so the policy manifesto which they create in 1983 is a very far left manifesto. It famously includes proposals like unilateral nuclear disarmament. So unilateral disarmament basically means that you on your own, without any similar agreements elsewhere, scrap your nuclear weapons and you end your program, and you remove your nuclear weapons basically completely. So they wanted to call for that, which in the Cold War, in a Cold War climate, was seen as absolute madness. They wanted to end Thatcher's privatisation program and renationalise all industries that have been privatised. They also, crucially, wanted to leave the EEC, the European Economic Community, which is obviously the forerunner to the EU, and they wanted to massively increase welfare spending. What happens is they get crushed in the election. The 1983 election is one of their worst defeats for generations. And that leads to a new leader, a man called Neil Kinnock, taking over, and he then begins to shift the party back towards the right very gradually. He abandons a lot of the policy commitments under Michael Foot, and he even begins to question Labour's commitment to nationalisation. He does, however, continue to retain quite a strong commitment to improving welfare and also using Keynesian policies to help increase employment levels. So under Kinnock, the shift is basically they scrap the stuff about nuclear weapons and nationalising industry to an extent, and they just focus more on welfare and jobs. So they sort of shift that towards the right a little bit more. More radical shift though which takes place is when a chappie called Tony Blair takes over in 1994. So Tony Blair takes over and starts to create what's often referred to as New Labour ideology. So Blair comes in and he claims that he's still committed to traditional Labour values, but the way he's going to achieve them is going to be different. And the very first thing he does, one of the most important changes Blair makes, it's a very significant one, is Blair was adamant that Labour would end its commitment to nationalisation. And he does this by rewording something called Clause 4 of the Labour Party Constitution. So Labour have a constitution, a document that essentially got a founding document. And one of the parts of it is called Clause 4. Clause 4 basically calls for the nationalisation of major industries. The wording of it is that the workers should own the means of production. That basically means nationalisation. That's been the Labour Party Constitution since 1916. Blair successfully manages to pass a motion at conference, a Labour Party conference, and they reword Clause 4 to remove any reference to nationalisation. So under Tony Blair, Labour abandons their commitment to nationalisation for the first time. Which is the first major change he makes. Additionally, Yeah.
Clause 4 calls for the nationalisation of all industries.
Yeah, all major industries. Yeah.
Are these Thatcher impacts? Because couldn't that just have happened without Thatcher?
That's the argument. So there is an argument that it's because of Thatcher. Thatcher is shifting Labour towards the right. The counter-argument, though, as you'll see, and I'm going to go with you right exactly, there are arguments that no, it's not because of Thatcher, there are actually other reasons behind it. So here's another reason, for example. There's one reason that, actually, Blair's quite keen to appeal beyond Labour's traditional voter base, and instead sought to attract this typical working-class Thatcherite voter, this kind of man that they label Mondeo man. So if you ever follow election cycles, political parties will finance these researchers to go off and look into what are the voters saying, and they'll kind of create a profile for a really important voter demographic who they have to get their vote. And for Blair, it was Mondeo man. Mondeo man being your typical working class man living in places like Essex, on the outskirts of London. But they basically support low taxes. They want to own their homes as opposed to renting council house. But at the same time, they're still concerned with the state of education in the hospitals. So this is basically Mondeo man. And also it tends to be a bit more materialist as well, hence Mondeo, because they wanted to own a Ford Mondeo, which was considered to be a nice car to own. And so Blair kind of is keen to try and attract this new demographic of voter. And so he seeks to change, Labour's image by keeping Thatcher's tax policies and not reversing privatisation, but promising to offer better public services instead. And the idea being that Labour has to try and desperately appeal to this new kind of voter who no longer this working class demographic who doesn't really identify with them. And so you can argue that these changes are motivated by the desire to respond to a changing electorate. Now you could argue that point about the electorate can go both ways. You could say that motivation was because Thatcher battered them 3 times. And so it's enough is enough, we have to beat the Conservatives. And so you could say this, you could still say that Thatcher, or you could swing it as Labour recognised that the electorate simply was changing and had to try and appeal to this new changing electorate, and that's why they changed, not because of Thatcher specifically.
But didn't you say that it changed because of Thatcher?
Yeah, you could, exactly. You could say that the electorate itself changes because of Thatcher. So you can swing it both ways. You can argue it either way convincingly. I think at least you could. So it's your choice which way you want to use it. So, essentially, they refer to this new ideology, or Blair refers to it as the third way. He'll often call it New Labour, he often calls it the third way. And so New Labour ideology was basically an attempt to find a third way in politics between the extreme free market capitalism of Thatcher and the old Labour left. So he sought to kind of make this middle ground between the two polar opposites. And so, New Labour ideology accepts Thatcherite policies in terms of their economic ideas. So they accept Thatcherite economic policies. So that basically includes commitment to free markets, rejection of Keynesianism or corporatism as economic strategies, rejecting nationalisation and actually keeping the privatisation of Thatcher, also a continuation of the PFI schemes that John Major started, and internal markets, and also an acceptance that welfare dependency is something to be tackled. So in that sense, his ideology is very much in continuation with Thatcherite policy. On the flip side though, they sought to spend more on things like health and education, important public services basically. They want to introduce the minimum wage, they want to expand workers' rights, they want to protect minorities. That next point, the protection of minorities, I'm going to take a question in just one moment. This final point about protection of minorities, that point I've put in brackets, hallmark of the New Left, that's the way in which you can argue that actually a more significant impact on their ideology is the New Left. So people like Ken Livingstone, although he's considered to be ideologically massively opposed to, say, Blair, Blair adopts a lot of the New Left and Ken Livingstone's ideologies in terms of things like ethnic minorities, attitude towards sexuality, etc. Golia?
What internal market?
So you know when we looked at the NHS, the rollback of the state, do you remember how we said that the NHS the hospitals became independent, and instead the local authority had to buy services from them, and so the hospitals are competing with each other for money. That's what about the internal market, and so they kind of continue that. So Blairite policy in many ways, or Blair's policies, though it's like New Labour policies, are basically an acceptance of Thatcher's economic policies, but stresses dealing with some of the inequalities which they may have created. That's kind of a basic way of summarising it. So their social policies are more traditional Labour policies. In terms of the reasons for those changes, so as you guys have been suggesting, how much can you actually attribute that to Thatcher? It's a bit questionable, isn't it? And so there's a few things you can add to that. First of all, you can argue that the return to moderate policies was actually a natural trend. People often compare Blairite policy or New Labour policy to Michael Foot in 1983. Michael Foot was exceptional. The early 80s period was a very exceptional period in terms of Labour Party politics. It's actually the only time when Labour was taken over properly by the hard left of the party. The party has traditionally always been dominated by moderates in other periods. If you look at all their major leaders, Harold Wilson, Clement Attlee, they've always been considered to be on the moderate or even the right wing of the party. So actually, it was only natural that Labour, after Michael Foot was defeated, would go back to their being a bit more moderate. So that's the first part. Naturally, Labour tended that way anyway. There wasn't a major impact of Thatcherism, that's exaggerated. The second point is even some of their, even going even further than that, some of Thatcher's policies were actually implemented to some extent before she even took power under Callaghan, who was a Labour leader. The best example of this is monetarism. We talk about how monetarism is this really controversial Thatcherite policy. James Callaghan, who's Labour leader from 1976 to 79, as Prime Minister, to try and tackle inflation, which is really becoming a problem under his government, he actually introduces some monetarist policies. So again, this idea that Labour is being influenced by Thatcher isn't so accurate. Labour had already begun to flirt with quite right-wing economic policies in the first place. So again, you can argue it wasn't really Thatcher which made this change. They were already tending that way. They were already tending that way in the first place. And then lastly, you could argue that actually those same electoral disasters that drove desire for change were arguably due to Labour division in the first place, and the SDP split, which I'm going to go into now. So actually, it was because their own internal divisions that they kind of created these changes. But I'll go to that point in a bit more detail in a sec. So, last point, last party. Yeah?
Social Democratic.
Yes, Social Democratic Party. So, oops. Okay, so, last part I'm going to look at, and then I'll link it back to Labour as well at the end. So, very briefly, because you can also mention this as well, because they're quite significant, Thatcher arguably also has an impact on the SDP and the Liberals. The SDP stands for the Social Democratic Party. It's basically created in 1981 when Labour lurches to the left under Michael Foot. 4 former cabinet ministers, I think the people involved are, I think it's Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, Bill Rogers and David Owens. These 4 high-profile Labour, former cabinet ministers, defect from Labour and split and create their own political party, having rejected radical Labour policies of Michael Foot and the Thatcherite extremes of the right. The SDP gets created, and they immediately go into alliance with the Liberals, who have been steadily recovering since the war. So the SDP and the Liberals go to election time on the same ballot. They're basically allied together, and so it's called the SDP Liberal Alliance. The SDP and the Liberals, they gain a significant vote share. I think at one point they get a quarter of the vote in the country, and I think in 1983 they finish only 2% behind Labour, if I'm not mistaken. But they failed to make significant electoral breakthroughs, because obviously, as we know, Britain uses third past the post, and a quarter of the votes doesn't always get you a quarter of the seats, and they actually get very few seats. And so they kind of, like Labour, gradually begin to be, as I said already, arguably influenced by the Conservatives in their abandoning of some of their policies. In particular, the SDP Liberal Alliance in 1983 continued to support a mixed economy, okay? So having aspects of nationalised industry. However, by 1987, they had begun to favour privatisation. However, like we said with the Labour Party, the extent to which this can be chalked or sort of put down to Thatcherite influence is debatable. Best example of this, if we look at David Owen. So David Owen, one of the guys that I mentioned, he was the leader of the SDP. David Owen was part of the Callaghan government. The same Callaghan government we mentioned had already begun to shift towards the right in terms of their economic policy. So, on the one hand, he's already been part of a government that shifted towards the right, and clearly he was of that same persuasion himself. Additionally, there were other similar trends on the European continent, and it's arguable that actually people like him were more influenced by what was happening in Europe and their economies, and a desire to copy that, than being influenced by Thatcher herself. And then lastly, in terms of the SDP and the Liberals, you can also make an argument that they themselves have an impact on party politics after in sort of the 80s to the 90s. They can be given credit for some of the changes that take place in Labour under Tony Blair. The main one is this. Blair introduces policies like a Bill of Rights, freedom of information laws, devolution, so devolving powers from Westminster towards Scotland and Wales. Those policies are adopted by Blair when he takes over, but actually those are all originally liberal ideas. And so you could argue that the large-scale acceptance of these policies by Blair and Labour in the first place was arguably caused by the Liberals. So when you look at this question of what's causing, what's influencing Blair, it's not just Thatcherism. He's also being influenced by the Liberals on the one hand, the Liberals and the SDP, and even some left members of his own party as well. So, in summary, for that last one, so I'm going to summarise it all. All major political parties certainly embraced free market economics before 1997. However, you can't really solely attribute that to Margaret Thatcher, as we've said. The right of the Labour Party had already begun to drift away from those positions before Thatcher even became Prime Minister, as had many European economies. Additionally, some parts of her legacy were abandoned as well. In the Conservative Party, they kept her policies, but her actual style was abandoned. Additionally, Labour, they kept her economic policies, but rejected her social policies. And then lastly, you can argue that there are other influences or reasons to be found for changing party politics. So, for example, the New Left can be seen as the reason behind why Labour adopt more of an emphasis on minority rights. Liberals can be seen as being a reason behind ideas for reform, which Labour introduced as well. Additionally, we can also refer to Labour's desire to simply appeal to a new and emerging electorate. And that's a wrap.